Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from break for those of you who decided to take a break, and welcome to the continuation of the week for those of you who didn't. It is really my great pleasure today to introduce my friend and colleague, and we used to be grad students together, Andy Zepp, who is the executive director of the Finger Lakes Land Trust, which is an organization that is based here. It's headquartered here in Ithaca, and it provides conservation and sustainable development programming and services across, I think it's 12 counties, is that right? In the whole Finger Lakes region. So it started out as the, I think it was the Tompkins County, wasn't it? Land Trust in the early days?
Well, actually, it's going to be started.
It was Finger Lakes, okay. So anyway, it did start out as a smaller hub, and Andy had a big role in growing it to be truly Finger Lakes wide. And he's been he got one of his degrees from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and Environment here at Cornell. He has another degree from Cornell as well. And he's been a conservation professional for at least 30 years, maybe more. He's assumed a number of other roles. He's also been part of a national land trust network based in Washington, D.C. He was with the Nature Conservancy for a while, and he has a very stellar career. But mostly what Andy's famous for is growing this amazing organization here across the Finger Lakes that has numerous roles to play in helping, not only protect lands, but also make sure that they are available for sustainable development as well. And he's going to talk about how they've been doing that. And so welcome, Andy. We're really glad to have you here.
Well, thanks, Louise, and thanks all of you for coming today. I'm going to talk about the work we're doing here in the Finger Lakes. Our organization, which was established in 1989 and now has grown to have 18 staff and a network of probably 200 volunteers at any time. But as Louise mentioned, I've also worked nationally and internationally a bit. So I'll also touch on issues that are common to land conservation in North America, and also have some experience in South America and Australia as well. And the development issue is not what I started with. I started in conservation in about 1986, but you cannot achieve successful conservation without addressing future economic development and people's wants and needs. This is at its simplest. This is two photos. How many of you have ever been to a place called Brook on the south side of Ithaca? You can actually, it's a long walk. You could walk from here. It's the next gorge down from Buttermilk Falls. And when I was an undergraduate in the ILR school, given my love of nature and low-cost tuition, this was an area that back then you could access on the Finger Lakes Trail. You still can today. And you see people enjoying it. That's a photo from the 19th century, and there's a photo from the 21st century. And the concept is a simple one about land trusts, is there are special places, whether that's a pristine gorge, our last undeveloped shoreline, our best agricultural land, these lands that the community has identified as important. And while government regulation has a very important role to play, there's also a role for someone not to tell a landowner what to do with their land, but within the framework of what the laws say, work in a kind of define the win-win solutions for that family that is putting kids in college, that is looking at the land as an asset, and to use philanthropy, tax incentives, and to secure those sites. I'm pleased to say this is a preserve. You can visit today. Anyone can visit. Very popular. And back when we first started the Land Trust, there's a railroad, or actually you can see Route 13, just south of Wegmans. And this picture was different then. There was no conserved land on the right side of Route 13. And Brook is an example of how conservation typically happens today. It's not just the land trust. On the right, what you're looking at is land that was acquired by New York State Parks in gray. That is a common partner of ours. The Cornell Botanic Gardens natural area has a part of it. We own outright, the land trust owns land there that we're responsible for managing. But then there's a beige color there on the right that is privately owned, but subject to a perpetual conservation easement, so development is limited. So all that's happened in about the last 20, 30 years. And now we're going up that watershed with the goal of securing the entire watershed. And an important thing about land trust, it's not about blocking development generally, it's about shaping it. Particularly in upstate New York, relative to population growth, we have lots and lots of land. We have no shortage of land, but typically there's a conflict because what the market wants, I want to live on the lake. I want to live on the steep, fragile slope so I can get a good view. I want to chop up that farmland into smaller parcels. So it's less about quantity than how it happens. This is our mission. There are two types of land trust specialists. For example, I've worked with the Colorado Cattlemen's Land Trust. They focus working with ranchers on securing grazing land. There are urban land trusts. There are wetland land trusts. We are like a lot of land trusts, though, that we're generalists. Across this 12 counties of the Finger Lakes, we work with the public sector, local communities to conserve land that's important, that is a variety of types. And this is our service area. It's the size of a small state. It includes the Finger Lakes, all 11 of them, as well as a considerable portion of the watershed of the upper Susquehanna River. So when you drive south from Ithaca, only about 10 miles, you go over a small hill, and from that point south, all that water goes out to Chesapeake Bay, while the Finger Lakes all drain north and it goes out to St. Lawrence. And this is looking backward. To date, we've conserved about 29,000 acres. That includes a network of nature preserves that we have that are open to the public, and those are in green. We also help partners such as New York State, the US Forest Service, the town of Ithaca, help create parks and conserve land. Those are in purple. And then again, we use this tool called a conservation easement to secure land that remains in private ownership, and that's in tan. And the bigger the bubble, the larger the acreage. Now, years from now, our goal is not to cover the entire region with bubbles, but to be strategic. And actually in our region, there's a lot of consensus on what lands are important. There's just not consensus on how to conserve them. So here you see too, since we were founded in Ithaca, a lot of the way landowners learn about opportunities is through peer-to-peer learning. So consequently, more has happened in Ithaca than anything else. So what are the resources we're trying to protect? Water is foremost. One is the Finger Lakes provide public drinking water to more than 1.5 million people. That does not include all the private drinking water supplies that many lakeshore property owners have. Also for water, the lakes themselves for tourism are a huge driver in the economy. So water quality is a big concern. I'm going to talk a lot about that. Agricultural land. We have really productive agricultural land, $1 billion economic driver. And for years, we do not have great development pressure. So farm conversion was not a big issue. I'm going to talk about a major challenge now is how do we accommodate large-scale solar energy development in a way that also does not erode too much the agricultural land base. Forest, particularly to the south, we are part of a continuous band of forests that extends from roughly Georgia up the Appalachians into New England. Some of this in our area was cleared for agriculture and is reforesting. It provides an important corridor, particularly with climate change, for plants and animals to move. In fact, I just read a paper the other day of looking at connectivity issues for mountain lions, should they be reintroduced in the east. And lastly, it's fuzzy but important. For a region with a $2 billion tourism economy, really it's an issue of aesthetics or beauty, that a lot of people do care about what does the place look like. And this gets into conservation issues, but also design. If you drive around, frankly, a lot of our region looks pretty junky. If you ever go to Vermont, it's not as junky. And that's an issue where the land trust, apart from working with individual landowners, works with county government, planning boards to try to do the best they can, both for conservation, but this too affects development potential in the economy. Since the founding of the Land Trust, we have been focused on water quality. And this is a picture of our Roy H. Park Preserve, about 15-minute drive from campus. It's a beautiful portion of 6 Mile Creek that is hosts native brook trout. It's part of a block of about several thousand acres of conserved land. And it also helps protect the city of Ithaca's drinking water supply. We do similar work on Fall Creek, which is the source of Cornell's drinking water supply. We also, at a site like this, we look for where multiple values can be served. This particular area can be a water quality project. It is an ecological significance, has a recreational value. So when we see all those values being served, that bumps it up on our priority list. Now, this is a small role we play because if you think of protecting water quality, the answer is acquire all the land around the creeks. Not going to happen. But in select areas, it can play an important role. Last year, we tackled our most ambitious water quality acquisition. This is Bell Station, which was slated to be a nuclear plant in just north of here in the town of Lansing. And for about 50 years, New York State Electric and Gas, which had assembled a 500-acre block of land with 3,400 feet of shoreline, sat on that project, that property. Clearly, a nuclear plant was not in the cards in Tompkins County. And what we, like many projects, we have to work at the pace of the landowner, which is typically an individual with extended family and adult children. In this case, it was a corporation, but we worked on this project for about 13 years. And it was, some of the issues we had to deal with is, in this case, we were partnering with the New York State, which wants to create a state wildlife management area, a public conservation area there. But a key thing, New York State wildlife areas are exempt from taxes, from property taxes. This is adjacent to what's now a defunct coal-fired power plant. The town of Lansing, where that is, was freaking out. The biggest taxpayer in the county, the power plant, was going away. And here we were taking 3,400 feet off the tax rolls. So that led to this lengthy process, more than a decade. In any event, it was slated for an internet-based auction last fall in a hot market. We did what we considered a Hail Mary effort, asking the governor to step in to stop the auction. She did, and we bought it. But again, in this case, we don't want to own it in perpetuity. We're helping the state. They have forest rangers, it's very accessible shoreline. There's a level of care and public use that we're really not set up to do. So we are in the process of acquiring that land, getting it in state ownership. But in this case, the way we dealt with the tax base issue is that we're looking at utilizing 200 acres of the agricultural fields for a combination of agrivoltaic solar and then probably just some pure solar. So this is incredibly complex and we're in the midst of it, but optimistic that'll happen. And then meanwhile, on the left side of the screen, there's what was the Cedar View Golf Course, which is that kind of area you see with scattered trees in the field. And the family that owned that had been there for 6 generations, needed it for their retirement. So at the big development potential, it had lake frontage, it had 2 roads connecting it, and now it's adjacent to 3,400 feet of shoreline. So in that case, we're buying that too. So all of that will be a public conservation area that will be accessible, but that's an example of kind of all the kind of issues that could come up. A bit of an extreme example, but just again, developing consensus every step of the way. Now, our organization in 2017 was doing projects to secure land important for water quality, but we had a huge wake-up call, as did most people in the Finger Lakes, when we had region-wide outbreaks in 2017, every Finger Lake of cyanobacteria, which are also known as harmful algal blooms or toxic algae. This is off East Shore Drive in Ithaca at the time, and it is can be toxic, bad for human health, not bad for a renting an Airbnb on the lake, not very appealing. So this has become kind of an existential threat to the region, particularly in economic terms. Most of the Finger Lakes, there are 12 counties, 2 are growing in population. Tompkins County here and Ontario County towards Rochester. One has flat population growth. 9 are declining in population. Manufacturing has, by and large, been in decline. You have basically a poor region, a lot of poor rural communities with wealth on the lakes. So the lakes are very important economically. Cyanobacteria are not an invasive species. They've been around for many, many years. The issue is they're activated. They like phosphorus, they like to be fed. They like warm water rather than cold. And then you have these blooms, which are problematic, particularly for drinking water. Now, we looked at what the issues were. First is phosphorus. And north of Ithaca, the region is quite agricultural. And I'm going to talk about how agriculture has changed and is changing. But this is Taganic Falls State Park, not far from here. After a heavy rain, you see the sediment plume entering from what is a fairly agricultural watershed. There's phosphorus in there. That's the feeding part. At the same time, with climate change, summer water temperatures in early fall, particularly August, September, it's warmer. So if you have phosphorus and it's 300 feet down in a Finger Lake, it really doesn't matter. It's inert. It's more if you go off Stewart Park where it's very shallow and the water temperature comes up, then the cyanobacteria can use it. So phosphorus is a key issue. In fact, in 2016 was a very dry year. 2017 was very wet. So they think 2017 is the worst year we've ever had. They think it was because of the buildup of nutrients in 2016, then the flushing of extreme rain events. That plume, you can see, that is miles long sediment extending from the city of Ithaca to past Myers Point in Lansing. So that, and I can show you, if I was to show you region-wide, they vary, but every Finger Lakes have that kind of nutrient loading. And in part, this is exacerbated by climate change because this little waterfall is actually Maple Avenue in West Danby in 2017, after that area got 6 inches of rain in about an hour. And that's what climate change for upstate New York is bringing: super saturated storm cells that are holding more water. And that storm at the airport, they got like an inch. This is maybe 10, 12 miles away, 6 inches in an hour. So imagine what that's doing for flushing off farm fields and nutrients. So climate change, there's two issues. One is warmer, makes the cyanobacteria happier, and these intense storms flushing the landscape more. And then, so we're focused on how do we reduce this loading, which is both land use and both stormwater management. At the same time, the wild card is zebra mussels were brought over unintentionally in the 90s, but we didn't get these outbreaks. What happened? Well, zebra mussels have a limited distribution in the Finger Lakes. There's not tons of habitat for them. They're kind of like a bathtub ring. Well, they have a cousin called the quagga mussel that followed them. And my understanding is mussel researchers are not the most well-funded researchers. So I think it took a while to go to the bottom of Owasco Lake at about 150, 200 feet. They found billions and billions. So wisdom was, well, there aren't enough zebra mussels really to make a difference in volume. Well, then on some of these lakes, maybe not all, there's this issue of the way that these filter feeders are altering nutrient flows. They're not sure how, but maybe favoring the cyanobacteria. North of the Finger Lakes, looks like Iowa. Intense, super intense agriculture. But there always has been for over 100 years. Why would that matter? Most of our region's agriculture, it's commodity. It's corn, soybeans, and a hay rotation. You're competing with Brazil, Iowa, Australia. It's about scale. So each year the equipment gets bigger, and if you have a $300,000 tractor, this is off Route 89 on the west side of Ithaca after just a regular thunderstorm. I don't know for certain, but I'll bet you if we go back 40 years, they didn't farm this little middle part. It was probably too wet. They didn't want to turn, there was probably like a little scruffy area. But if you've got this big piece of equipment and you're competing globally in upstate New York, you want to max out production. So you see now, those are little soybean plants. And another key thing is 40 years ago, there were weeds. Well, with Roundup Ready crops in June, there's no other weeds. There's just these little baby plants that don't hold much soil. So you're seeing sediment and phosphorus going right in the road ditch. In this case, it came up on the road. So how agriculture is practiced is changing, and it's a problem to some degree. Another thing is we have a lot of large-scale dairy, and you've got to move massive amounts of manure and spread it in all weather. And we have a wet climate. So in times like April, you don't want your equipment getting stuck and you don't want the water to pool. So there's a technique called tile draining, which has been around for eons. And Rebecca Schneider at Department of Natural Resources can talk all about this. But a big issue is that pipe is depositing water in a road ditch. It looks clear and clean, but it's got phosphorus. That's been proven, so you know. But what it does is it intercepts the groundwater percolation. So it's reducing the absorptive capacity of the watershed, because rather than maybe seeping down 6 to 8 feet, it's getting cut off at 3 to 4 feet. So what that does in these road ditches is create more extreme kind of flash flooding. So that's a problem. I should mention the issues we're seeing in our lakes is not just about agriculture. This is the Wegmans parking lot. If you ever go down there, where does anyone want to take a guess if you had a leaky, car or something, you're leaking some gasoline, where does that go? What happens if you spill something in the Wegmans parking lot? Straight into the lake. There's no detention basin, no filtration. This is when the lake's at high level. That's the back of a lot. So we do have in Ithaca urban runoff issues, but if you look at a map of the Finger Lakes, outside of Ithaca, towns are pretty small. Watkins Glen, you can focus a lot on perfecting that, but where the landscape is, agriculture is massive. So with the resources we have, we're focused on that. But it's not to say there aren't issues places like here. So what do we do about it? Well, for starters, there are limitations. This is a view from Ithaca Falls at Stewart Avenue. And you can see today, if you were to look at this, the high school is right in the middle of this photo, which would be underwater. And Fall Creek has been channelized. Ithaca had extensive wetlands downtown that are now downtown. That filtration function is not likely to come back. So there are limitations. You have to first look at what is feasible. But the concept is for 200 years, understandably in a wet climate, we focused on getting runoff away from our homes, our roads, and our farms, and getting in the lake as quick as possible. The problem is it's a perfect way to maximize phosphorus loading in the lakes. So the Land Trust is looking in within the constraints of not flooding people out and causing problems for the farmer. How do we simply hold back, mimic what was here 200, 300 years ago, hold back more water so when there is a storm event and there is phosphorus in motion, more of it goes down into the groundwater the way it once did and percolates and is filtered out in that way. So for example, if you go back pre-settlement, there were a lot more vernal pools, wetlands, just absorptive capacity that totally makes sense after 200 years of farming. That's not very convenient, so it's been eliminated. What you see here is on a Land Trust Preserve, a contractor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service constructing vernal pools and wetland that are kind of pretty simple in some cases, but meaningful when you have these big storm events. And the alternative is just all of it going in a ditch system to the lake. Here you can see there are 4 of them constructed here. We're working on some that are more natural, wetlands and vernal pools that have a wildlife habitat value, but also some are frankly going to be much more engineered systems that are going to be roadside detention basins. The big limitation is the hydrology's got to work. You have to design for the maximum store event. There's legal liability. You don't want to flood someone out downstream. And inevitably, if I go to the side of the road of a farmer in a ditch and I say, can I have that acre? Usually they kind of like keeping it. So there's a real estate availability issue. Another big step we're doing is particularly from agriculture, but sometimes residential development. We've encroached upon our stream systems too much. Vegetation, woody vegetation can play a major role in stabilizing those areas. Planting and expanding stream buffers is another area that region-wide a lot of work is going on. Also, our road system has really altered stream system by modifying flows. In many cases, roads act like dams. So where it used to be sheet flow, now there's a culvert that is shooting in storm events, high volumes of water. This is a preserve we have on the west side of Keuka Lake, tiny stream. you can see every year tons and tons of soil and phosphorus going in the lake. And this was due largely to State Route 89 acting as a dam, like I described. And in this case, it's a bit experimental. We're working with the US Fish and Wildlife Service. So we had to first build the grade back up. So and then using a combination of natural materials of log and rock to absorb that energy so it's not down cutting and eroding all that away, but kind of a riffle and pool system, which was just developed last year. And it's been a pretty dry year till now, so we're eager to see how it works. But this is another example of the type of work of kind of designing and restoring systems so that they still, they're more natural and have less negative consequences, but recognizing we still have to do that within the context of residences, roads, and farm use. This is at our Van Riper Conservation Area, which is right off Route 89 in Romulus, and it's right off the main entrance, so it's easy to see. Now, as we're working on water quality, the Land Trust also pursues projects that are just purely for securing our best agricultural lands. Years ago, there were much more diversified crops here. There was a large vegetable crop production in upstate New York, but places like California have totally, outcompeted the region. Who knows in 100 years of what production will look like out in the San Joaquin Valley? We may need this land, climate change and variables. So this is a case where we use a conservation easement to compensate the farmer for the development rights, and it's still their private property, but they agree that it stays a farm, so when they sell it, it remains a farm and is not subdivided. Some of these are large scale, up to 1,000 acres. Some, in this case, in Seneca Lake, vineyards as well. So we get funding from the state of New York through the State Department of Agriculture and Markets. And we use what's called, again, a conservation easement. And this is a legal agreement that becomes part of the deed to the property that puts limits on future use. So typically provides for traditional agricultural and forest uses, but ensures that when that's passed down or sold, it usually addresses, issues of subdivision, building, and frequently buffers. Now, the work starts when whoever made the agreement either dies or sells, who very much understood what they were getting into. The land trust has to deal with whoever owns that property, and we're up to 170 of these agreements. I can say our track record is good, but if we think of a more crowded future and pressures on the land, it's going to be a big challenge, because it's a challenge in creating a legal document that's supposed to outlive you, that doesn't either micromanage the future in a way, think of your best friend owning it, that's annoying, or creating a loophole for a bad actor that is, could be exploited. It's what we try to do, but it is a challenge. Now, relative to agriculture, the big challenge is going to be how we accommodate large-scale solar, and also in a way that is compatible with sustaining agriculture, which isn't just soils, it's people making a living on the land that have equipment suppliers and critical mass of neighborhoods of farmers for economic efficiency. And New York State has really incentivized rolling out utility scale solar, but really aside from grid connectivity for how to move the electricity, really there's not a lot of planning. And just yesterday, Syracuse.com, which is a news site, said that there's a new microchip plant planned for Syracuse that will increase demand because it's a very energy intensive industry. Aside from needing to convert existing needs to renewable, that'll add, I don't know how accurate it is, but it said the equivalent of 1 million homes of additional need that their plant will need at the equivalent of the electrical need of 1 million average homes. So this is going to be a huge challenge. To the south, this is only about 45 minutes away near Elmira. Beautiful forests. We have black bear, bobcat, lots of wildlife, but ownership is very fragmented. And in time, there will be change that we want to make sure there are these intact corridors that wildlife can use. This is the Shamong River, a focus area for us. One thing in such a big area, the land trust if we just worked with whoever called us, we could do lots of projects, but the impact might be quite modest. So we do occasionally work with people who come in the door, but a lot of times we've consulted with state and international conservation plans and said these areas are important, so we're proactively going out to the people who own those lands, trying not to annoy them, but at that moment when they're ready to do something with their land, make sure they're aware of us as an option. In Ithaca, we're at the northern edge of this kind of continuum of forest on kind of the hill country of the Allegheny Plateau. And this is area that has, on the hilltops, soils high in clay. It was farmed, but it's not particularly great. So in the Depression, the federal government had a buyout program. So if you look at a map of state lands, state conservation land, you'll see the speckling of state lands all across the southern tier of New York. And it's because it's poor farmland that in the 30s, there was a voluntary buyout program. And we call this the Emerald Necklace, which is about 40 to 50,000 acres of existing public land. But you can see it's not connected because the valleys in between have a little better soil. So those farmers didn't sell. Well, now development is coming out. So our goal is to maintain connectivity, both for wildlife movement, but also for humans, so that we have the Finger Lakes Trail extending through that area, which is an increasingly popular recreational resource as well. And this shows how it fits into the broader picture of looking at climate change and habitat connectivity. This is a map produced by the Nature Conservancy that is part of a larger map series for Eastern North America of looking for the future. How do we ensure plant and animal movement between core areas that would include the Alleghenies in Pennsylvania, the Adirondacks, and extensive forests of northern New England. And this is painstaking work because what it looks like, again, bobcats are doing very well, not far from where we are today, but we really do think we can accommodate larger predators in the future. But this is what our world looks like. This is, a modest bike ride from here, a short drive. This is at the end of Coddington Road in the town of Caroline. And it's connecting the dots. You see a state forest on the left, a state forest on the right. And you're looking at about 5 different land transactions as we try to knit it together. That dashed line is the Finger Lakes hiking trail. And we have acquired the Land Trust 3 parcels on behalf of the state of New York to add to the state forest. We have a new nature preserve that serves as an access point kind of in the middle. And then we helped another nonprofit, the Finger Lakes Trail Conference, acquire that purple piece. And we've got a ways to go, but this is a lot of the work of the Land Trust is behind the scenes trying to bring that about. But we also recognize that if we don't manage this land well, what will we have accomplished? That if it's just invasive species and overgrazed, that's not what we want. And what we've learned is in our region in particular, the challenge of deer overpopulation. And this is a shot from the town of Ithaca. It's a deer exclosure. So on the left is regenerating forest where the deer can't get to. And on the right is what is all too common and people think is normal for our woods, which is not normal. This is the result of these excessive deer populations. We do have a hunting program, but also on a property by property basis, we're learning how limited, if you own, say, 200 acres or so, it's really hard to manage population. So this is getting into policy issues at the state level to look at changing how deer population and sport hunting is done in the state. Because quite frankly, we're just not, it's a growing problem. We're going the wrong way. And it's part land use too. Because if you leave Ithaca in any direction, and if I choose to build a house in the country, I immediately create a deer refuge because typically no one's going to hunt near the house. So if you have this low density pattern we have where usually houses, there aren't housing development, it's more here a house, there a house. Every new house favors the deer. So that's also making the problem, bigger. I can tell you too that we issued 300 hunting permits this year, got 107 deer. If you ask the guys who got the deer, they might say, yeah, there are too many deers. If you ask the 200 who didn't, they probably say, oh, Andy, there aren't too many deer. So that's an issue as well. This is a shot from Keuka Lake. Before kind of opening it up for questions, just want to point out a lot of what we're doing too is this region is not the wilderness. It's not the big city. It's this mosaic, this in-between of agricultural landscape, natural areas, small villages and towns. We also are recognizing we need to do more to connect people with nature. I was this morning in a small city of Auburn, an hour from here, where we've recognized after we've protected all this land, but there are people, underserved communities we have to connect better with. We're looking at in a place like Auburn is what would it mean if we applied our mission within the city limits? That town or that city really doesn't have great green space or access to nature. So we're looking at that as the next level. And with all this stuff, it can be quite depressing at times, you know, and you can get pessimistic. But I love this photo from Taganic Falls State Park with nesting peregrine falcons, which were absent from there for about 70 to 75 years. And they're back. And, you know, we're extirpated from the whole region. So nature is surprisingly resilient if we give it a chance. So with that, I'll be happy to address any questions you have.
So let's see if we're going to need the mic. I think I will be prepared to bring the mic around the back. For those of you who have questions closer up front, we won't. We'll see if we can get by without using it. But as Andy says, the floor is open for questions or comments, and I'll just let Andy pick and choose, and I'll be the holder of the microphone as needed.
In the back.
Andy, this would be a great opportunity to announce your paid internships over the summer.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Thank you. Thank you for the reminder. Just to let folks know, the Land Trust is having 2 paid internships this summer for 10 weeks, 32 hours a week. And we're particularly seeking diverse applicants. It'll be, you know, probably if you go to our website, fllt.org, there's information there, and probably make a selection in April. So happy to talk to folks after. It's designed to give a total immersion to our world of conservation, every aspect of it, with the bulk of a good chunk of it of hands-on stuff relative to land management, but then by design, exposure to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or farmers or just everything else, the fundraising. So.
When you say Michael, I think you do need it. Thank you for your presentation. Okay, thank you for your presentation. My name is Diana Ulloa. I am a Humphrey Fellow from Ecuador, and I also work in water conservation. So I was wondering if it was difficult to convince people to move from conservation of biodiversity to conservation of water, because sometimes we are like focusing only in biodiversity and not consider what is the value of water that is bringing to society. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I started out with the Nature Conservancy in the late 80s. So for years, I focused on biodiversity. And frankly, most people didn't care or thought you're kind of strange, of like in our region anyway. So actually getting more involved in water, which I think has there's a much broader support. So I find, at least in the United States, getting buy-in that it's a problem is easier, but getting the solutions are so complex. So, but in terms of getting new state programs for financial support, to get consensus that we should do something, I find that much easier than biodiversity, because I found that it was just less central to people's lives. However, you know, if you look just in our little Finger Lakes area of how challenging the solutions are going to be, you know, it's going to be huge.
I'll do the one in the back here, and then Ed.
Thanks. Could you talk a little more about, in the context, about how the organization thinks about it in the context of climate change, the relationship between land management for flood control versus nutrient and runoff management, and how that might vary from a rural to an urban context. And
Yeah,
I don't
I
know.
would,
And
I
even
would
if you
just,
focus on urban, you did mention the city of Ithaca, which is why I threw
Yeah.
an urban part there.
I would break it into three, kind of responses. One is recognizing part of our mission is to connect people with green space and nature, and that urban spaces require, because of just levels of use, fragmentation, a very different approach than, say, rural conservation. On our lands that we manage, which are small in the scheme of things, our largest property is 800 acres, which in one hand, it's good to walk around, but in the scheme of the changes in our environment, it's tiny. So we just, with our limited resources, because our management resources are limited, just try to make intelligent choices of kind of bet hedging that understand the limitations of what we know about 200 years from now. In terms of specifically about nutrient, stormwater issues and nutrients, I think it's a 12 county region with 11 large lakes. We recognize that the Finger Lakes Land Trust is not going to solve this problem, but we lack currently model projects of different sorts. So we've started with kind of what's easier for us is wetland restoration with the Fish and Wildlife Service and vernal pools. But we see it as a continuum. We need them and lots of them, as well as restored streams, but as well as probably concrete lined detention basins. So I think our role will be, we want to be a catalytic role, and then see particularly the public sector take this on. But our actual role may vary on, we do see owning kind of natural infrastructure. We don't see owning concrete detention basins.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. My name is Ed Mabaya. I'm wondering if you could comment on how profitability of the farming enterprise in upstate New York and the type of farming enterprises, for example, the big commercial crops, maize, soybean, vis-a-vis maybe the fruit and vegetable that you're talking about, how that affects the work that you do. Does it make it harder or easier when farming is becoming more profitable, or is it making it
Well, there's
more challenging?
Relative to farming, there's two edges. If farming is more intense, makes our farm protection work easier, maybe, but makes our water quality work harder because of the encroachment. In general, though, I talk to farmers all the time because we're trying to design these easement agreements that will stand the test of time. And that a lot depends on, well, what the heck farming is going to go on here in 50 years? Nobody knows. And when I see in our climate and we have high property costs, we have high energy costs, we have high labor costs, there are a lot easier places to grow corn and soybeans here. And I talk to these guys and I go, are you going to be doing this another generation? And some say, oh yeah, we will. And I'm skeptical because having been to much larger areas with lower costs. Dairy, I think because of the proximity of population, I do see some conversion of large scale grain operations to dairy. So I think we will continue to see that, which is a challenge in our climate and our water quality issues, just because when you have 3,000 cows and their manure and you have winter conditions, it's very challenging. But I think that is the trend. I do see, I think over time, commodity grain crops will decline in footprint because competition. The challenge we face on vegetables is any retail premiums that we do not, Rochester, Syracuse, the premium market, I think is rather limited. So you can try, but I think raising a family on it is very difficult. And New York City, there's enough farmland within 2 hours. There are some people from the Eastern Finger Lakes who do market directly to the city, but it's challenging because of distance. And in the Hudson Valley, there's a lot more going on in that regard. I think what it would take is a change where good chunks of, say, California, Arizona can't produce vegetables anymore. And suddenly our costs go up here, our vegetables. Then suddenly it becomes economical to compete for New York State. So I think that's still speculative in the future.
We have a question from our Zoom audience. Yeah, sure. He's wanted to deal with the issue of industry area. Question
two good questions. First, on the tax base issue, it is not an issue where there's growth. So, for example, the town of Ithaca, they can see build out in the future. They know when there's going to be no more open space. They actually buy parkland themselves. So it's kind of predictable. If in tax base, most of the taxes come from structures, from homes, built environment. Land is less. So if an area has any growth, it's not a problem. If we go to the southern tier, there are areas that are quite depressed. It's kind of more symbolic, but it is an issue. So that's why conservation easements, there's some tax incentives for the owner, but it leaves the land on the tax rolls. So we recognize that if we take land off the tax rolls, we better have a good reason. And it also should provide clear public benefit. In terms of economic development, of course, this is the driver of, I'd say, most political discussion. We recognize that, we participate in it. In terms of manufacturing, I'd say it all depends on what we're talking about. But I think particularly in Rochester and Syracuse, which have lost, just thousands and thousands of manufacturing jobs, whether it's manufacturing or something else, there's a big need to bring in economic activity of some sort to restore those communities. And we acknowledge too, we're not experts in this, but what we do know is whether you're at Cornell or Corning, Inc., you're competing for talent that's looking at Boulder, Burlington, Vermont. And if we don't provide the amenities and the quality of life, people are mobile. So that the things we're talking about, clean water, outdoor recreational trails, scenery, that if you don't provide it or if you let it deteriorate, you're going to lose. So that's our niche. We don't pretend to understand how to restore Rochester, but we do know because we hear it a lot from folks at Cornell, Corning Inc., other employers that they got to really hustle to recruit people to come here.
Another question? You stand up then? I'll make sure. Yeah, sure. First off, thank you so much for being here. But I grew up in South Carolina, and at first glance, there's not a lot of diversity going on. If you look a little closer, there's the Amish, there's the Mennonites, there's like classic farmers, and all these groups have very similar economic books, but very practical ones. So what is the role of the
Two very, I'll answer that in two ways. One is we do deal sometimes with Amish and Mennonite farmers. And whether someone's Amish, Mennonite, or English, so to speak, their approach to land management and this ideas we have could vary. So some, it's like, it's not a comment, I get it. If I was farming, well, I don't want someone to look over my shoulder. So we try to minimize that, but it really is just being respectful and where the interests align. Very different story about working with the Haudenosaunee, where there's the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas, which we're engaging them in different ways because on Canandaigua Lake, we're doing a lot of work, and particularly with Ganondagan, which is a joint New York State Seneca historic site for the Seneca. But we're doing a lot of land conservation work of sacred sites. So that's a very different, much more involved discussion with the Seneca, where for those who aren't aware, the Cayuga have had really big conflict internally, which it makes us hard to kind of figure out how to engage. So that's been more kind of like, how can we work together? And with the Onondaga too, where there's a lot more going on, a lot of it's just about patient, respectful conversation and listening and like first do no harm. So, but that's very different than with the Amish or Mennonite communities where it's more landowner by landowner like any other land.
How would large-scale rice farming affect water conservation in central New York?
Well, I only know I actually ate some rice produced in Casanova, New York, which was eye-opening to me that you could even grow it here. So it's a good question.
I know a farmer in Vermont that grows rice and ships it down to New York City. So
no, I think that's where we just recognize whatever we predict of what farming will look like here in 50 years, probably totally wrong. So we just understand that we can't know that. So we try to do the best we can of coming up with conservation strategies that do not micromanage, but don't create loopholes for a bad actor, and recognize that some of this is unknowable right now.
But you could make a guess how rice farming would affect water conservation. Would it increase algal blooms?
Actually, I know nothing about rice farming, other than that one in Casanova. I can tell you, I'm not an agronomist, but I can tell you a little about corn, soybeans, and hay and cows, because they're everywhere. But no, I don't know. I really don't know.
Thank you very much for sharing this information about how land trusts function in the United States. Can you talk about whether or not the land trust model is something that is used in other countries, or if there are barriers to using a similar model elsewhere?
Well, one big difference in Europe is there's a lot less, individuals have a lot less control over capturing the market value of undeveloped land. So to some extent, looking back, Europe, you don't have the free market approach you have here. It may shift that way. So you don't need a land trust if there's a community decision on whether I can convert my farm into housing. So very different, and because of land limitation issues in Europe, particularly for agricultural land. That may change some of the trends. So maybe yes for land trusts in the future, where it has, you think of similar kind of legal frameworks. Australia and Canada have growing land trust movements, and particularly in South America and Chile, they're looking at kind of how do you take the existing legal framework in particular and modify some of these tools so they're applicable there. And so it's a mixed picture, but it really depends on one part, to what extent is there a need for a land trust? Because if government is playing a greater role, a land trust wouldn't make sense. But then you also need some stability and confidence that an agreement you set up with a private landowner 50 years from now, the framework's still going to be solid, which is a question even in the United States for not so much the land we own, but they could, we're exempt from taxes on that. That could change, whether it's us or Cornell. And similarly with these easement agreements that are shared with the owner. Ask me in 100 years.
Okay, well, we're out of time. I would just like to make folks aware that a copy of the Finger Lake Land Trust most recent newsletter is in the back. It's now being waved at you. And please feel free to take one on your way out. And of course, you can learn more from the website as well. I'd like to thank Andy very much for coming.